Today, I want to talk about misunderstanding Christian leadership. And there's a lot of that going around, and hopefully when we look at Scripture, we will correct the misunderstanding and think properly about Christian leadership and about what leadership means if we are Christians. It's not just leadership in a Christian organization or in a church or in a mission agency. Certainly that needs Christian leadership, but if we are believers and we're leading anything, anywhere, then the principles of Scripture about what Christian leadership is, then those certainly apply. Now, there are some best practices in any kind of leadership context anywhere, and some of those are deeply rooted in the Scripture, but there are a lot of people who aren't believers and aren't Christians at all, but nevertheless, they talk about a lot of leadership practices that really are biblical, whether they realize it or not, like servant leadership. There's a lot of literature in the business world and in non-religious nonprofits that point to servant leadership, which of course is what Jesus described as leadership. And so we want to look at some of the misunderstandings and let Scripture correct those misunderstandings. And misunderstandings lead to misbehavior. And Scripture corrects not only the misunderstanding, but also the misbehavior. There are so many misunderstandings out there. Some are funny, some are tragic. I was reading recently about Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. If you can picture a map of Mexico and you follow it south toward the southeastern part of Mexico, there is a peninsula, the Yucatan Peninsula, that sticks into the Gulf of Mexico, borders to the south, Guatemala and Belize. When the Spanish explorers first landed in that part of Mexico, of course, they started asking the native people they met there, what is this place called? What is this country? And of course, none of them spoke Spanish. They answered in their language. And what the Spanish people thought they were saying sounded like Yucatan. Now, later on, once that was named the Yucatan Peninsula, known as that to this day, but what it meant in the original language was, we don't understand what you're saying. There was a complete misunderstanding and miscommunication. Now, that might bring a smile to our face or a little chuckle, and it really doesn't matter. It's a crazy name for a part of a country because of a misunderstanding. But if we start misunderstanding leadership, especially as believers, especially leadership in the church or in a mission context or in the ministry world at all, then it's not funny, it's tragic, and can be destructive. And more than anything, it can hinder or mar our witness for Christ. So I want to look at a Scripture that clarifies how we should think about leadership from a Christian perspective, and it clarifies how we should behave as leaders, and also shows how we grow in leadership. So let's look at Mark chapter 10, and we're going to look verse by verse, verses 35 through 45. And we'll see if we can spot some of the misunderstandings and maybe some of the corrections when we see how Jesus responds to his disciples. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." So Jesus says, "Okay, I'll play this game. What do you want me to do for you?" And the first misunderstanding of leadership, it's in these two words, for us. When leadership is centered in us, when leadership is about us, when leadership is for us, when leadership is for our own benefit, for the primary benefit of the leader, that's not Christian leadership. That is a complete distortion and misunderstanding of what leadership is supposed to be as followers of Christ. For us. It's supposed to be for others. Verse 37 gives our next misunderstanding of leadership. The disciples said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand, one at your left in your glory." You see, they saw leadership as a position of authority. In that culture, in that world, when the leader was there, the person sitting on their right, the person sitting on their left, those were places of authority. The further away, the further back, and wherever else they might be were lesser places of authority, or maybe places of no authority at all, or maybe places of no recognition at all. But boy, the right and the left, the right hand and the left hand, those were positions of authority, and it is a misunderstanding. These disciples who thought leadership was for us And they thought leadership was a position of authority that we have. And so then we see how Jesus responds. They said, a position of authority, right and left, in your glory. That's the next misunderstanding, in your glory. And we think about it, if we bring it into the modern age right now, we think of the glory of leadership, and we think of the lights and on a stage with thousands of adoring people and or hundreds or whatever it is, a stage and a mic and all of this stuff, and the glory of people clapping, and if we preach something strong or laughing at a bad joke because we're up there with all of the trappings of glory. It's not what leadership is at all. Leadership's the opposite of that. Most of leadership is not glory. Most of leadership is not applause. Most of leadership is not, it's like the glory of the blue check mark brigade. If we get the blue check mark, then somehow we are this glorious leader. That's how people think about it today. And so we go now, we get past this idea of a position of authority, past the idea that leadership is for our own benefit, past the idea that somehow leadership is this glorious thing. And what Jesus says in verse 38, he said, you don't know what you're asking for. Are you able to drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said, yeah, we can do it. When we think about this idea of the cup and the baptism, it comes up again as Jesus is preparing for the cross and while he's on the cross. And there's this cup that he's agonizing in prayer before the Father saying, I don't want to drink it. And there's this baptism in a cup of sacrifice and this cup of suffering. And that's part of leadership. Jesus is trying to say, no, it's not this glorious thing. There's suffering and there's sacrifice. And are you willing to do that? And they flippantly say, of course we are. Let's get to the glory part. And we get down to verse 40. And he says, look, you will be in 39. You're going to experience some suffering and some agony and some pain and some sacrifice. Even though you're blowing past that right now, it's going to happen. And then he says, but to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. So as Jesus is correcting their thinking about leadership, he's pushing aside their misunderstanding of it's for us, it's for our benefit, it's a glorious thing, it's a place of power and position and all this. He goes, no, it's not that. There's suffering, there's sacrifice. And then he says, it's not my choice, it's not yours. And to understand leadership, the way Jesus presents it, we have to understand suffering, sacrifice, and in this part, sovereignty. It's the choice of the Father. And the older I get in ministry and I look back and I reflect back, I realize that I see more than I've ever seen the sovereign hand of God in the positioning and the place and the leadership responsibilities and the leadership weight that I've found myself carrying. And maybe as a younger man, I thought it was either the result of my prayers or maybe my hard work or other things that somehow I was still had agency in that. But the older I get, the more I see the sovereign hand of God. And that's kind of what Jesus is getting at right here. To sit at the right and left, that's not my choice. There's a sovereign God who's making these, he's preparing ahead of time how we will lead, where we will lead, what type of leadership and the weight that we will carry. Verse 41, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John, which is a little bit hypocritical because they're all thinking the same thing. It's just these guys were honest enough to speak it. Verse 42, Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. So he's saying, look, it's a Gentile leadership style. It's a Gentile leadership philosophy. A Gentile, in their minds, those were as far as you could be from God. It's Gentile thinking I'm hearing coming out of you. To think of leadership as lording over, to think of leadership as an authority position is Gentile thinking. So he says, but 43, but it shall not be so among you. Don't think that way. Don't think like the world. Don't think like those far from God. Don't think like whatever the modern cultural pictures of a leader, whatever that is, that's not us. Jesus says, not among you, But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Before I mention servant, I want to go back to that among you. The implication in Jesus thinking about leadership and developing leaders, there's always an among you. But unfortunately, in our modern world, in our celebrity culture, even, I hate to say it, even in the modern church, in the celebrity worship leader, the celebrity preacher, the celebrity pastor, they're not among us. They're separate from us. They kind of float in from a green room to a stage, deliver some kind of message, and then disappear. But real Christian leadership is lived out among the people. My view of preaching is the preacher is a part of the congregation and emerges from the congregation to serve with the gifting that God's given and re-engages that community and lives out the truth together, not someone who lives outside of that. So there is this among you that is so important in Christian leadership, and it's how Jesus led. When Jesus had massive crowds, if you read the tension, there'll be great crowds. The next thing you know, Jesus is meeting with that small community he had, those 12. And then you see great crowds, and Jesus would retreat to a small community. And he was living out his leadership among a close community of friends and fellow workers who were walking together in all that they were doing. So not among you. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. He says, whoever wants to be first among you, there's that among you again, must be slave of all. And slave and servant were two ideas that were very close, but not exactly the same, and not exactly the same as slavery later in history. But this idea of servant and slave, it's not something anybody wanted to be. It's not something any parent would think, boy, I hope my son or daughter becomes a servant or a slave one day. But this is what Jesus was calling them to. Leadership is a call to something that people in their right minds don't really want to do. But nevertheless, that's what it is. For even the Son of Man, verse 45, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life ransom for many. Not to be served, but to serve. If I think about understanding leadership properly, there's sacrifice, there's serving, there's this servant's heart, there's suffering involved, there's the sovereign hand of God involved, all of that. When I was new in ministry, there was an idea that was very popular really all around the world and in all sizes and all types of ministry. And it was this idea that if you really wanted to grow in leadership, you needed to find a leader and serve that leader. And that took on all different types of shapes and all different types of meanings. It's not exactly how Jesus said to grow in leadership. It's actually the opposite. While I thought I'll learn leadership by serving a leader, maybe there's truth in there somewhere. But if we're leaders, that's not a message we give people who are growing in leadership. But Jesus said, if you want to learn how to lead, then the way they learned how to lead was watching him sacrifice and serve and submit to the sovereign hand of God, even if it was something he didn't want himself. You want great leaders around you? Don't tell them to serve you. You want great leaders around you? Let them watch your example of submitting to the sovereign hand of God. Let them watch your example of sacrifice and suffering. Let them watch your example of serving the least. And you know what? You'll wake up one day, you will be surrounded by amazing, godly Christian leaders.